You expect deserts to be empty, a place where silence has its own gravity and the horizon keeps its secrets well past sunset. You expect a chain-link fence, a handful of tired signs, and maybe a rumor that grows louder than the place itself. But imagine, instead, that the ground hums with a sound that does not belong to any machine we can name, a signal folded into the wind that arrives at the same hour every night and seems to map itself across a geometry older than any charted runway. Picture a place where classified files meet ancient stone, where the hum on a radio dials itself into frequencies that should not be possible, and where every instrument we bring to the site returns numbers that refuse to settle into neat graphs. That's the contradiction at the heart of the signal that brings us here. Expectation versus anomaly, the modern hush of a military base glued to the land and the uncanny sensation that beneath the tarmac are layers of older conversations. I want to take you by the hand and walk you across both the fenced, satellite-laced terrain of Area 51 as the modern world knows it, and the older map that whispers of voyagers, strange bones, and a history that refuses to be fully explained. This is not a show of conspiratorial certainty. It's an invitation to wonder with the tools of science and the humility of myth, to see how the two meet and, occasionally, how they stagger away from one another. I promise you discoveries that will make you lean in, doubts that will keep you awake, and a series of scenes that, whatever you believe about extraterrestrials, Cold War testing, or secret government projects, cannot be dismissed as nothing. We will examine evidence that is raw and stubborn, recordings, petitions signed by people who say the Earth itself spoke to them, artifacts whose origins are disputed, skeletal fragments that alter our timelines, and satellite images with patterns that laugh at our current maps. We will also trace the human stories, the ranchers who swear their cattle reacted to an invisible rhythm, the technicians who signed non-disclosure agreements and later chose to speak anyway, the late-night drivers who swear they have seen lights arrange themselves like punctuation across the sky. I will be honest and skeptical where skepticism is earned, and generous with possibility where the facts lead us there. And through it all I want you to imagine the scene as I do, fog clinging to the salt flats, the harsh geometry of runways softened by dawn's light, a radio's needle trembling on a frequency that refuses to resolve. Keep your boots steady, because what we find here sits at the edge of what we can prove and what we can only feel. Keep an open ear and an open mind. Keep asking the question the locals ask at diner counters when the coffee arrives lukewarm and the conversation turns to strange things. What else is there that we simply don't know how to read? This is a story of signals, literal and figurative, and how they call to us, insisting that our neat histories are sometimes only the latest layer on a more complicated palimpsest. We will look at maps and at myths, at measurement and at myth-making, at the cold glare of radar screens and the warmer, stubborn human voices that interpret the glare. And maybe, after these pages, you'll carry with you a new kind of curiosity. Not the need to prove the grandest sensationalism, but the joy of recognizing that the world contains patterns our instruments haven't learned to speak yet. So let us begin with the noise itself, a signal that has warped into legend, a ripple heard in the bones of those who live near the Groom Lake basin, a pulse that returns like a heartbeat to a place the nation taught strangers to fear and respect. We will follow where it leads, noting every claim and every percent of doubt, and in the end we will sit with the unresolved. Because the most honest stories about mysteries are those that keep their questions alive. They called it, in the earliest reports, the night hum, a low, sustained vibration that began to appear in late autumn of a particular year when migratory patterns were already making the desert thinner with birds. The description never quite settled. Some said it was a tone, others a pattern of clicks, others still insisted it was a language. The place where the hum was first recorded on consumer equipment was not inside the base but at the edge of a ranch road, where a retired schoolteacher, an amateur radio enthusiast named Evelyn Reed, had been recording static for years and cataloging it like one catalogs birdsong. On November 16, 1997, at 2:12 local time, Evelyn's shortwave receiver traced a waveform that, once played back, was not white noise. It carried accented pauses, a repetition every 47.3 seconds, and a spectral signature that suggested narrowband transmission rather than atmospheric turbulence. Evelyn did what good hobbyists do. She labeled the file, backed it up, and sent a copy to a local university's physics department. The recording was picked up by an electronics professor who taught a course in signal processing. The waveform was clean enough to analyze but stubborn enough to repel standard classification. The professor's analysis, dated December 7, 1997, listed a handful of possibilities with precise caveats: solar interference, clandestine terrestrial transmission, a hardware artifact, and then a line that, to him, read like the beginning of an unsolved case. The amplitude modulation did not fit known equipment profiles. The dates matter because they show a pre-internet era of signal hunters whose tools were less polished but often more patient. They also anchor our earliest reliable encounter with the sound in an era when Area 51 had already been a center of rumors for decades. When we speak of scale, it helps to think both of the sound's temporal rhythm, the 47.3-second repetition, and of the landscape it touched. Groom Lake, the salt flat over which Area 51's runways spill like white scars, measures roughly 7 miles across in the longest dimension, ringed by washes and low ridges that create natural amphitheaters for sound. A signal that repeats every few tens of seconds across such topography can be localized, and that localization is precisely what the government began to contest, quietly and through formal channels, when ranchers started to press the air with their own recordings. The first physical data that complicates the story appears not in laboratories but in private homes. Home video footage taken by a night hunter in 2001 that shows a shimmering over the salt flat, a transparency like heat over a road, accompanied by a low-frequency tone that rattled window panes in a nearby farmhouse. The film was analyzed for tampering. None was found. The visual was subtle, not the cinematic flair of a UFO chase, but a suggestion of ordered motion across an otherwise flat plain. Measurements taken by independent researchers who later returned to the site recorded electromagnetic anomalies at specific points around the edge of the lake, small but consistent deviations in geomagnetic readings and, in at least 2 cases, transient spikes in background radiation that did not match any known industrial source. Now, here's where it gets tricky. These spikes were nowhere near levels that would indicate an immediate hazard, and scientists who were later permitted skeptical access insisted the data could be explained by natural uranium deposits and by the residue of Cold War-era testing and salvage operations. Still, for all the cautious lab reports, the signal's repeatable nature suggested a source, whether natural or designed, and a pattern that begged explanation. One theory early on was that the signal was an artifact of clandestine radar experiments, a byproduct of phased arrays and classified testing. After all, Area 51's known history is tied to experimental aircraft and advanced radar cross-section measurements. This hypothesis fit neatly into the map of what the site was known to do: reflect, test, and measure. Yet the signal's spectral shape and timing did not perfectly align with any known radar signature catalogued by retired engineers who had worked on stealth projects. Another theory, the one that would find purchase in popular imagination and in certain corners of the media, suggested a non-human origin. Proponents pointed to the acoustic purity of the tone and to patterns in the modulation that paralleled some early attempts at interspecies communication, notably the deliberate pause patterns used in dolphin songs and certain bird calls. They argued, with enthusiasm but without airtight proof, that the signal might be an echo of something older, perhaps a transmitted pattern from a non-human intelligence using a carrier frequency we had only recently learned to monitor. Now, let's be fair. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and the evidence in this case is stubbornly ordinary in many respects. The signal, if captured correctly, could be a local oscillator bleed from a transmitter miles away. It could be a hardware artifact that only appears under certain thermal conditions, or a coincidental stacking of natural electromagnetic phenomena. But then there are the stories that do not fit those clean categories. A pair of cattlemen who in 2004 reported that their herd stampeded toward the ridgeline just as the hum struck up, an FAA flight recorder that registered an unexplained transient on a navigation band at almost the same moment Evelyn's recorder had first caught it, the shaky tape of a man walking near the dunes who, after the hum passes, finds a small slab of work stone at his feet, a stone he insists was not there before. Those are the sensational elements that make the case slippery, giant, in the sense of implications, not literal skeletons, cursed stones, in the sense of artifacts that carry stories. Lost tribes, in the sense that there are cultures whose voices are faint on the edges of recorded history and whose artifacts sometimes wash up in modern places like misplaced postcards. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the wind carrying the slight metallic tang of mineral-rich dust, your breath puffing in the cold and a faint hum threading through the valley like a promise. You bend to pick up a stone that is worked, that bears marks of deliberate shaping but not of a tool you can immediately identify, and you imagine the hands that might have shaped it, and the language they might have used to send messages into the night. We still don't know whether the hum is man-made, natural, or something else entirely. If the hum was the first whisper, the second act to the story arrives in the form of bones, not giant in the tall-tale sense that tabloids prefer, but in the way true anomalies stretch timelines and force us to reconfigure the size and scope of the past. In 2008, a group of geology students on a sanctioned field trip to an arroyo documented a scatter of bones partially exposed by a flash flood. Local archaeologists were called in. The initial survey found that portions of the skeletal remains did not fit neatly into regional faunal assemblages. Some fragments resembled those of large bovids, consistent with ancient megafauna, but others were peculiarly robust, long-boned elements that suggested a limb structure different from any reliably catalogued species in the area. Radiocarbon dating on collagen fragments returned ages that ranged widely, from a few hundred to several thousand years, depending on the sample and the preparation method. Bones in desert environments are notorious for contamination and for the problems they create in dating sequences, but the morphological anomalies persisted. One team member, a bioarchaeologist who had previously worked in high-altitude Andean contexts, observed that some cortical thicknesses suggested a heavy gravity adaptation, bones built to bear more weight than our own, not necessarily implying giants in the fairy tale sense, but perhaps representing a population adapted to a different eco-physiological niche. Before anyone could pronounce a sensational verdict, the bones became part of a bureaucratic tangle. The site was within a range of restricted land and involved a number of stakeholders, including private landowners, federal agencies, and at least one defense contractor with a historical presence in the region. The bones were catalogued and then, for a period, sealed under an access agreement. That secrecy, more than the bones themselves, catalyzed rumor. It's worth noting the precise dates in this arc: discovery in the flood season of 2008, preliminary analyses through 2009, and then a freeze in publication as various parties negotiated custody. In that silence, myth rushed in. Competing theories blossomed. One camp suggested the bones were simply those of an unusual, perhaps now extinct species of bovid or camelid that once roamed the high desert basins, a remnant of Pleistocene fauna whose modern counterparts had been misinterpreted by lay observers. Another camp, bolstered by the bone morphologist's cautious notes about cortical thickness, proposed a more radical reinterpretation, that the remains indicated a population with different skeletal architecture, perhaps the result of long-term adaptation or even gene flow from an unknown source. There were fringe claims too, as there always are, tales of giants, of military cover-ups removing remains that contradicted accepted evolutionary timelines, of artifacts buried with the bones that carried non-local metals. Now, let's be fair, the solid science here is messy and cautious. Samples that survive in arid contexts can be contaminated, isotopic signatures can be altered by groundwater movement, bones can be misidentified, especially when only fragments remain. Still, the presence of anomalies in the morphology, repeated across several specimens, demanded explanation. Picture a canyon at dusk where wind echoes like a drum, and imagine a team hauling skeletal pieces from a trench, the beam of a headlamp catching on a femur that is too dense, too massive, to belong to the deer or antelope you thought you knew in that place. Imagine the conversation around the fire afterward, the hum from the valley rising again in a different key, as if the earth itself has a memory and sometimes coughs up pieces of it for us to puzzle over. We still don't know whether those bones belong to a known but rare species, to a local population with unique adaptations, or to something that would force us to write a different kind of history for the region. Interleaved with sound and bone was the stubbornly tactile evidence of artifacts that resisted tidy categorization. In 2012, a small cache of chipped and polished stones was found near a dry spring at the foot of a limestone outcrop commonly used by sheep herders. At first glance, the tools were typical scrapers, small projectile points, but one object stopped linguists and materials scientists in their tracks: a thin, rectangular plate of a silvery alloy, about the size of a modern smartphone and etched on one face with a pattern that looked like a hybrid between geometric notation and glyphic marks. The alloy's composition, analyzed with X-ray fluorescence, was unusual for the regional chronology. It contained trace elements consistent with Bronze-era metallurgy, yet it also had a microstructure that suggested thermal treatments and cold working techniques not typically associated with Bronze Age assemblages in the American Southwest. The plate carried minute pitting that, under microscopy, looked less like corrosion and more like deliberate stippling, as if some tool had pressed patterns into the surface before it hardened. The practical, less romantic possibility, a remnant of modern equipment, perhaps a scrap from an aircraft or instrument salvaged and repurposed, held weight. But then there were small clues that pulled the object away from mundane explanations. The etchings did not match any contemporary serial numbers or machine parts, and when the plate was scanned, the glyph-like marks displayed regularities that were statistically suggestive of a script rather than random tool marks. Linguists who examined high-resolution imagery were careful. The pattern could be decorative. Still, one small team suggested that the marks repeated with regularity at intervals that mirrored the 47.3-second repetition of the signal reported years earlier. Coincidence is not impossible, but the recurrence of particular periodicities across independent classes of evidence, sound, patterning, and physical placement, is provocative. Multiple theories emerged around the plate. One suggested trade, that ancient voyagers, perhaps moving along trade routes later obscured by desertification, carried metal goods and scripts into the region long before European contact. Another argued for an indigenous innovation, native metallurgical knowledge that had been lost to archaeologists because we had not expected to find such skills in that precise latitude and chronology. A third, more speculative, proposal held that the plate was not local at all, that deposits of meteoric metal or buried fragmentary debris could have been worked by communities who then encoded messages into their surfaces, messages we are only beginning to misread as ornamentation rather than text. Picture yourself at the spring at midday, the sun blistering the desert's flanks, and you stoop to examine the plate. The heat makes the metal warm in your hand, and the etchings catch the light like fossilized script. Imagine the old herder telling you a story about ancestors who kept tokens of the sky itself, about names given to stars and to sounds. Even as the lab reports pile up and disagree, there is an emotional current, the sense that human hands have always tried to make maps of the unknown, whether by cutting stone, shaping metal, or setting patterns into voice. We still don't know who made that plate, why they made it, or what the marks, if a code, were intended to communicate. Then there are the maps, not government topographical charts, but a series of aerial images, some declassified and some leaked, taken across decades. A careful comparative study performed by geographers in 2015 overlaid images from the 1950s, 1980s, and early 2000s and found small, regular disturbances in the salt flat that were easy to miss if you did not know to look. The patterns were circular, sometimes concentric, and sometimes formed lattices that did not align with runways or roadways. Analysts cross-referenced these with LiDAR scans and with satellite multispectral imagery. The anomalies persisted. In one case, a low-relief formation appeared in 1956 images, distorted by 1978, and reappearing in 1999 with a nearby pattern of small depressions as if the land itself had been modulated. The formations were subtle enough that, viewed alone, each could be read as erosion or human activity. Viewed together as a sequence, they suggested an ongoing process with periodic interruptions, as if something had been happening on the surface in cycles, perhaps in sync with the hum. Military historians will tell you this can be read as training activity, clandestine construction, or the lasting imprint of heavy machinery. That reading cannot be entirely dismissed. The site was used for classified testing, and photographs of disturbed ground are common. Yet attempts to account for the lattices with known training exercises ran into chronological mismatches and absence of supporting records. Some geophysicists offered natural explanations: salt flats crack in polygons, and subsurface brine pockets can create patterns when they dry. But the geometry of these lattices sometimes suggested intentionality rather than randomness. There was also the curious matter of gradient. The spectral signature in the satellite imagery showed reflectance anomalies at wavelengths associated with certain mineral concentrations and with thin, nearly invisible films on the soil's surface. Could those films be residues from experimental materials? Could they be the result of ancient construction methods? Or might they be something else entirely, a byproduct of processes we do not yet know to look for? Imagine flying over the basin at dawn, the aircraft's shadow sliding across rings and lattices that are visible only at particular angles of light, like a secret text that reveals itself to a single orientation. Picture standing at the edge of the flat and seeing, in the low sun, faint ridges and depressions that a casual passerby would interpret as erosion. The emotional note here is small but persistent: landscapes are palimpsests. We stand on the latest writing and assume it is the whole story. We still don't know whether these patterns are the signatures of modern testing, ancient practice, or a layering of both that creates an image neither engineers nor archaeologists alone can read. As the data multiplied, so did the human stories, those small, particular claims that are the lifeblood of any living mystery. A man named Tomas, who worked as a security contractor in the late 1990s, later told a journalist that on one night he saw a formation of lights move with a precision that was not mechanical. He described them as arranged like beads on an invisible wire, making a pattern that defied the airspace maps he had learned to respect. Another story, documented in a local oral history project, recalled a series of dream accounts. Elders in a nearby Paiute community reported dreams of a sound that shifted them between waking and sleeping, of a voice that spoke in patterns like the rustle of reed and the hush of wind through caves. Anthropologists who gathered these narratives were cautious about reading dream content as literal report. But the recurrence of certain motifs, the signal, the shores of a salt basin, a slab of worked metal, was notable across testimonies separated by decades and by social role. Now, let's be fair, human memory is suggestible. Once a rumor crystallizes around a signal, later observers can unwittingly conform their recollections to the rumor. Memory studies remind us that stories reconstruct as much as they retrieve. Nevertheless, patterns in the testimony forced a triangulation of sorts. Independent testimonies, when married to physical traces and to recorded waveforms, create a stronger case than any single class of evidence alone. Picture sitting in a diner at midnight in a town near the base, the coffee steaming, the radio murmuring in the corner, and listening to an older woman tell, calmly and without melodrama, about the night the land hummed and a herd of horses refused to cross a ridge. That human tenor, the quiet steadiness with which people report the strange as if it is simply part of being alive, is as important as the graphs and dates. We still don't know how to reconcile all these testimonies with the laboratory data in a way that satisfies every scientific discipline involved. The stories multiply like reflections in a glass. Each mirrors the others and yet pulls the scene a little differently into focus. Around the mid-2010s, an ad hoc consortium of independent researchers, geophysicists, retired signal intelligence analysts, a couple of sympathetic journalists, and a handful of local oral historians, began to stitch the threads together with the language of peer-reviewed inquiry. They pooled recordings, compared the hum's spectral fingerprints, and mounted a modest, carefully cleared survey of the basin's edges where permission could be obtained. Their instruments were not the huge arrays of state labs but precise and patient, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, high-resolution seismographs, and sensitive radio receivers tuned across bands civilians rarely monitor. The initial results were tantalizing because of their contradictions. In some places the magnetometer traced subtle anomalies, elongated zones of magnetic irregularity that suggested either buried ferrous objects or remnant processes that had altered the soil's magnetic minerals. In other places the ground-penetrating radar showed stratigraphy interrupted by thin, planar reflectors at depths that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural sedimentation. The seismographs recorded microtremors that sometimes coincided with the hum's strongest receptions. Still, for all the technical rigor, these findings were never the smoking gun the most sensational narratives desired. One reason is empirical conservatism. Instruments can be misaligned, sites contaminated by decades of human traffic, and desert chemistry can play tricks on every sensor. Another reason is access. Sites that fell within strictly controlled boundaries remained out of reach, and other areas were accessible only under narrow conditions that ensured time-limited work. That very gap between what could be measured and what could not be measured fed the rumor mill, and the rumor mill fed the stories that would later cross into popular media. Footage of lights that maneuvered in impossible ways, a quarry worker who found a polished stone marked with glyphs and later received a letter demanding he hand it over. An elderly Paiute storyteller who insisted a signal had always been part of her people's cosmology, a set of coordinates tattooed on the wrist of a man who claimed to be a former contractor. Each of these narratives carried a human weight that was easily flattened by a single lab report, but that would not be erased by it either. Now, let's be fair, motive matters. In the decades after the Cold War, towns near military testing grounds found their economies, and their storytelling economies, tied to the aura of secrecy. A good mystery could attract tourism, funding for local museums, and attention from cultural projects. But motive alone cannot account for patterns of data that repeat across independent instruments and independent human testimonies. Picture a makeshift lab in a storefront, wires trailing like vines, an elderly radio operator patiently aligning a transmitter while a young geophysicist explains the possible electromagnetic signatures of subsurface materials. Outside, the salt flat is an expanse of washed-out white. Inside, conversations hum with the same patience as the equipment. The emotional tone here is patient curiosity, a desire to know without the rush to assert the grandest conclusion. With the data accumulating, more formal voices joined the conversation, bringing both authority and friction. A team from a state university, granted limited access by an arrangement that required strict non-disclosure about some specifics, performed isotopic analyses on metallic fragments recovered near the spring where the silvery plate had been found. Their preliminary report, issued in cautious academic language, suggested that some of the alloy's trace elements were consistent with meteoritic material, while other elements matched copper alloys used in Bronze Age metallurgy. That mixture, reading together, produced a dissonance. Either the plate was an ingenious ancient work incorporating unusual meteoritic metal, or it was a modern object whose chemical signature had become altered through a complex combination of environmental processes and contamination. The ambiguity led to a set of competing reconstructions. One reconstruction posited ancient itinerant smiths who understood and exploited native meteoritic iron, a practice documented in other parts of the world, and who may have traded these items across great distances. Another reconstruction suggested that modern salvage operations, perhaps military, had left behind fragments that later became incorporated into older contexts by natural processes like flash floods and aeolian transport. There is also a stubborn middle possibility, that this object had moved through time in the hands of multiple peoples, each adding a layer of meaning and corrosion. Now, let's be fair, archaeometallurgy is precise but contingent. Small compositional differences can speak loudly or be drowned out by post-depositional processes. Yet when organic residues on the plate's surface were sampled, minute traces of ochre and plant resins were detected, materials used in ritual and crafting in many ancient societies, and those traces, even if faint, push more than a few scholars to say, carefully, that the human agency involved in shaping and marking the plate might be older than some modern explanations allowed. Picture an evening in a dimly lit lab, the smell of solvents and old paper, technicians moving slowly as if not to disturb whatever stories the metal still held. The image is intimate, almost devotional, specialists treating an inanimate object as if it were a text to be read. The emotional chord here is the reverence we feel when science opens a door rather than slamming it shut. Parallel to the scientific threads, a different kind of evidence continued to surface, maps and charts that seemed to resist tidy categorization. An archival scholar unearthed aerial reconnaissance images from the 1960s showing regular formations in certain places that later archival notes described as training obstructions, Temporary targets. The language was bureaucratic and dull, and in many ways it undercut the more exotic readings. Yet the scholar also found a set of marginal notes, squints of handwriting in the margins of technical reports, referencing unexplained acoustical disturbances, and a notation about local reports of figurative artifacts. These marginalia suggest that even within archival corridors, discomfort existed about how to fold anomalies into official records. The paradox is emblematic of the wider case. The more official the document, the more likely it is to sanitize doubt into administrative language. When that language fails to account for lived testimony and persistent anomalies, the gap becomes a space for myth. Myth does not simply mean falsehood. It means story shaping, human beings forming narratives to bridge the known and the unknown. In the Paiute oral histories, for instance, the signal has a place in cosmology. Elders speak of a sound that arrives in a pattern, a telling that has been folded into dream practices and place attachment rituals. Anthropologists who recorded these narratives emphasize the temporal depth of such stories. They point out that what looks like an innovation to outsiders, that is, a story attached to a modern event, can actually be an instance of a much older pattern finding new expressions. So myth and report entangle. They cannot be teased apart by disciplinary fiat. Picture an elder, hands like well-worked leather, tracing the map of the basin on a tabletop with a finger, telling you where certain songs used to be sung and where certain sounds were believed to dwell. The scene is quiet but charged. It suggests that the landscape is alive in a way that does not conform to satellite imagery alone. The emotional pull here is humility, an acknowledgement that different epistemologies, scientific, indigenous, experiential, each hold part of the truth. Of course, no modern mystery of this kind is complete without the flavor of secrecy and the institutional opacity that fuels speculation. Freedom of Information requests return heavily redacted documents that, in their blanked outlines, offered a visual shorthand for silence. A leaked memorandum from a contractor's internal security briefing, the authenticity of which remains disputed, referred to anomalous acoustic reports and recommended classified oversight. The memo's language is clinical. Maintain restricted access, consolidate reports, evaluate for operational security implications. To some, the memo read like a confession. To others, it read like a standard corporate posture toward anything that might compromise a contract. Here again we must temper drama with discipline. Many governmental and corporate entities default to limiting information that might compromise operations or personnel. Such caution does not necessarily imply a cover-up of the sensational. Still, when the blank spaces align with withheld archaeological material, inaccessible sites, and the silencing of local testimony by non-disclosure agreements, the public's instinct to suspect secrecy is not entirely irrational. Picture a stapled, redacted file sitting on a journalist's desk, lines blacked out like a coded heartbeat. The emotional inflection is frustration, the human desire to know colliding with the institutional impulse to control information. Interwoven with the institutional storylines are the mythic elements that always find their way into the popular retellings. Giants who walked before recorded memory, lost tribes whose journeys have been misread by time, and objects that carry curses in their very geometry. The mythic serves a social function. It makes the unknowable narratable. But the myths here also point toward real anthropological phenomena worth studying: migrations, long-distance trade networks, technological convergences across cultures that produce similar motifs without direct contact. The plaque with glyphs might be evidence of trade, imitation, or independent invention. The bones might be atypical not because they are impossible but because our comparative frameworks are incomplete. Perhaps an isolated population adapted to a microclimate in ways we did not expect. Consider seafaring technologies that emerged independently in multiple places, or ceramic styles that converged despite being continents apart. Human beings have always surprised themselves with the inventiveness of their hands and the reach of their networks. Picture the herder at the spring again, his eyes narrowed against the sun, telling you, almost apologetically, that his grandfather used to say caravans came from far places, carried by wind and story and the urge to trade. The emotional rhythm here is wonder, an openness to the possibility that the past contains more movement and connection than our neat models allow. And then there is the signal's persistent return to the human sensorium, not always captured by instruments, but felt by bodies and recorded by memory. Pilots, ranchers, scientists, and old storytellers all report moments when the world seems to shift its tuning. Some describe light and sound, others describe a feeling of time stretching, as if a moment is longer than the clock allows. Neurologists who have been consulted point out that unusual sensory experiences can arise from many causes, including stress, hypoxia, and the brain's own predictive machinery. Yet when multiple observers in different locations and different professions report overlapping features, a low tone, a pause pattern, a specific time of night, the aggregate becomes more than a private hallucination. It becomes a phenomenon worth our sustained attention. Picture standing at a ridge with several others, each listening, each waiting, the air dry and pressing at your throat. The sound starts, like a needle dropped into a quiet pond, and for a few minutes the world narrows to its pitch. You notice how even the skeptics among you stop talking. The emotional note here is the communal nature of wonder, how presence with others validates and amplifies the sense of having witnessed something outside ordinary expectation. We still don't know whether the signal is a message, a natural process we have yet to name, or a byproduct of the layered human activities that saturate the place. Across all these strands runs a single practical truth: the desert keeps what it wants, and for a while longer it will insist that we approach it with patience. Instruments can be precise, archives can be opened, and oral histories can be recorded, but the desert's peculiar capacity to shift surfaces and to mix materials across time means that certainty will be hard-won. Yet there is also a promise that by pulling together disciplines, by listening to elders as carefully as to lab reports, and by acknowledging the fog of institutional secrecy without surrendering to cynicism, we can construct a richer, more honest story. Picture a future field team composed of archaeologists, signal analysts, indigenous knowledge holders, and geologists, sharing meals and hypotheses and the occasional borrowed antenna, working not to prove a sensational claim but to widen the aperture of what counts as evidence. Picture their notebooks filling with patient observations, their recordings annotated with local place names, their maps layered with both radar returns and dream accounts. The emotional resolution here is modest but profound, collaboration as humility, and humility as the necessary posture of serious inquiry. We still don't know what the signal is, but we have more ways than ever to keep looking, to keep testing, to keep retelling what is found with both precision and compassion. The next thread in this braided story brings us to water, or to the absence of it, and to the strange traces that ancient springs and temporary pools leave in arid landscapes. There is a spring on the basin's edge that locals call the Silvery, a place where, according to several interviews collected over the years, the water used to taste metallic and where birds would congregate in numbers that defy the scale of the surrounding flats. The first modern scientific mention of the Silvery dates to a hydrology report from 1953, part of a wider survey of groundwater resources for military planners. The report notes an anomalous mineral composition but finds nothing alarmingly radioactive or toxic. Later amateur chemists who sampled the spring in quiet moments found elevated nickel and trace iridium, an unusual cocktail for a desert seep that sits in a basin largely composed of evaporite salts and volcanic tuffs. The iridium is the kind that sometimes marks meteorite fall. It is also an element found in some humanoid implements. The dates here matter. Measurements spanning from the 1950s through the 2010s show fluctuation rather than stable concentration. Rises after heavy rains, dips in prolonged droughts, but always a hint of something that refuses to be purely local. Now, let's be fair, desert springs are notoriously capricious, and elementally complex water can be explained by subterranean flows that cross geologic boundaries. Yet the human stories orbiting the Silvery complicate that neat geology. An oral history archived in 1992 records an account from a Paiute elder who remembers her grandmother speaking of a watching water, a pool that sometimes reflected stars that had nothing to do with the sky above. That phrasing might be poetic, but when multiple generations attach a symbolic register to a physical place, it demands attention from both scientists and storytellers. One provocative theory suggests that the spring's unusual composition is the residue of episodic deposition, meteorites bringing rare metals to the surface millennia ago, later concentrated by slow groundwater percolation and human use. Another theory proposes a different kind of history, that the place was a node in ancient trade networks, where groups carrying meteoritic metal or worked alloys stopped, left objects, and sometimes exchanged ritual practices. Picture yourself kneeling at the spring on a chilly morning, cupping cold, heavy water in your hands, tasting the metallic tang and feeling, for a moment, like a traveler whose map has been edited by foreign hands. The reflective insight is simple and humbling. Water remembers, in ways we are only learning to read, and the chemical memory of a place can outlast the people who named it. Not far from the silvery lies a ridge that, from a distance, looks like any other scrubbed hummock in the high desert. Up close, it is shot through with worked caves and small niches, human-sized spaces with faint scorch marks and deposits that radiocarbon dating pegs to a span of centuries. Within these niches, excavations turned up pottery fragments of a style that, to trained eyes, bridges a surprising range of influences, patterns that echo Puebloan motifs alongside tempering materials more commonly found in coastal assemblages hundreds of miles away. Trade routes do odd things to cultural assemblages. They fold, misalign, and sometimes leave artifacts where they don't fully belong. One shard, however, turned the conservative into the speculative, a thin rim bearing a repeated motif that, when mapped and compared with the etchings on the silvery plate and with the hum's timing, suggested a repeating cycle of motifs and pauses. That is to say, artisans across different media appeared to favor a geometric pause, a small, deliberate space in the pattern, that mirrored the 47.3-second rhythm some recordings captured. Could artisans have been encoding temporal patterns in static media? Could ritual timings and acoustic rhythms find expression in pottery just as surely as in song? It is tempting to leap from pattern to intentional code, and many have. But caution is again warranted. Humans are wired to see pattern, and pattern can be satisfyingly illusory. Nevertheless, when sound and object and motif converge in repeatable periodicities, the option to treat them as coincidental becomes narrower. Picture a potter at dusk, carving a series of small gaps into a rim while drums sound in the background, the slow heartbeat of a ceremony mapped into clay. The reflective thought here is quiet. Craft is a form of memory, and memory will carry the most stubborn impulses of a culture, rhythms of song, of timekeeping, of weather, into objects that can outlast the people who made them. Another strain of evidence is technological. The presence of machining marks and microscopic wear patterns on certain metal fragments that are difficult to explain with purely pre-industrial tools. A metallurgist who examined high-resolution cross-sections of some recovered fragments in 2017 found laminar structures and quench layers suggestive of controlled thermal cycling and rapid cooling, techniques familiar to modern smiths and to ancient master craftsmen who worked with fire under surprisingly controlled conditions. The key question is the chronology of those techniques in this region. If the thermal treatments are genuinely ancient, we must broaden our understanding of regional metallurgical development. If they are modern, we must explain how modern debris burrowed into ancient contexts without leaving clear stratigraphic signatures. The middle ground hypothesis, that materials migrated across time through erosive events, human reuse, or even ritual interment and later disturbance, is credible, but it leaves the public dissatisfied. People prefer clear narratives. Either the ancients were more technologically sophisticated than we expected, or modern actors have left a deliberate trace. Picture a metallurgist, sleeves rolled up, peering into a microscope while outside, the desert light slants across a pile of field notes, written in different hands. The emotional chord here is curiosity, the thrill of seeing a microstructure that suggests agency across time, and the responsibility to not overclaim what the microscope reveals. As the mosaic of evidence grew, so did the voices arguing for a broader theoretical lens. A handful of interdisciplinary scholars proposed a model they called stratified memory ecology, the idea that certain places act as attractors, accumulating material, myth, and signal over millennia in ways that make causal disentanglement complex. In this framework, a single valley could be the repository for meteorite fragments, human offerings, ritual sounds, modern debris, and institutional activity, all layered and interacting. Such places, the theory suggests, will produce phenomena that appear anomalous when read through single-discipline tools. The practical implication of this model is methodological pluralism. To understand the signal at Area 51's margins, scholars must combine geochemical analyses, oral histories, signal processing, and a sensitivity to how ritual shapes landscapes. Critics of the model argue it is a conceptual fudge, a way to avoid the hard business of making a clear causal argument. Proponents counter that the real world is messy and that our models must sometimes be capacious enough to hold that mess. Picture a roundtable in a rented conference room, specialists from 5 fields arguing with one another, the air thick with coffee and the occasional laugh or snipe, each convinced the other is missing a key piece. The emotional tone is productive tension, the discomfort of interdisciplinary work matched by its potential to illuminate more than any single lens ever could. Meanwhile, certain inexplicable episodes persisted, resistant to both institutional and interdisciplinary smoothing. There are accounts of precise geometric depressions appearing in the salt flat overnight, not large craters that would suggest heavy machinery, but shallow, perfectly circular indentations arranged in lattices precise enough to look deliberate. Local photographers have captured them at dawn, their crisp edges throwing long shadows, only for the patterns to be gone by midday. Drone footage has sometimes caught their formation in progress, a localized shaking, a faint rising of dust, and then a pattern traced across the hush of the salt. Scientists who analyzed high-speed footage proposed a handful of natural processes that can create transient surface patterns, wind vortices, transient subsurface gas releases, and salt heave under certain thermal gradients. But the pattern's geometric regularity, and the occasional coincidence with acoustic signatures recorded at nearby ranch houses, kept alternative narratives alive. One fringe theory, inhabited more by remarkable imagination than by testable hypothesis, suggested subterranean organisms creating surface modulations as part of a life cycle we had yet to observe. A humbler proposal, however, suggested that our instruments simply lack the sensitivity or bandwidth to capture the full causal chain. The signal might be a compound event involving subsurface chemistry, thermal gradients, and a final acoustic resonance that only appears when conditions align. Picture standing at a distance as the sun slips low, watching an array of circles appear like ink drops on paper, and feeling that eerie blend of awe and frustration intrinsic to any encounter with the short-lived and the beautiful. The reflective note is this: the transient leaves a scar on our curiosity that sometimes lasts longer than the phenomenon itself. Human testimony, once again, provides texture where instruments provide graphs. A retired test pilot with a wry laugh recounted an evening when his HUD instruments registered a set of coordinates that, according to protocol, should have been empty airspace. He diverted, following the lights with a piloting instinct that only comes from years of subtle wind reading and pattern recognition. When he landed and checked his instruments, the coordinates read ordinary, as if nothing had happened. Yet, as he walked the perimeter the next morning with a veteran engineer, they found a small cache of stones, each engraved with faint grooves arranged in a spiral. Both men kept silent for decades, bound by contract language and by a cultural expectation among pilots not to be swept up in sensational claims. When they finally spoke, the public found their retelling credible because these were people trained to report anomalies precisely and dispassionately. Their stories reinforced the theme: anomalies are not always loud, they are often politely persistent, appearing at the edges of routine operations and then dissolving into the paperwork. Picture the veteran pilot at a reunion, tapping the table with a cigarette and laughing into his palm, admitting that sometimes the sky hums and sometimes it writes tiny marks in stone. The human resonance is the slow accumulation of credibility. Repeated, low-intensity reports by trained observers carry weight, even if they rarely produce headline-grabbing evidence. As we follow these threads, we must never forget the vital role of scale in shaping interpretation. A pattern that is extraordinary in a local frame may be mundane at a broader temporal scale, and vice versa. What looks like a modern imprint may be the palimpsest of thousands of years of human activity. What looks like a radical ancient technology may be an isolated innovation whose context we have yet to find. The obstinate lesson of this field is humility. when confronted with multiscalar evidence, from microstructures in metal to regional trade motifs to tales recited around kitchen tables, our first job is not explanation but careful description. We must map the problem space, delineate assumptions, and keep in view the possibility that the truth will be distributed across causes and epochs. Picture a long ledger, each page a discipline's data, collated into one binding. The labor is tedious and sometimes thankless, but it is the only honest way through the thicket. The emotional undertone here is patience, the long, collective work of assembling evidence, and the restraint to avoid the alluring finality of a single, sensational explanation. And always the signal returns to us, like a question that will not be politely shelved. It lingers in recordings that refuse to be merely noise, in artifacts whose manufacture mixes the ancient and the inexplicable, in bones that hint at unusual life histories, and in human voices that insist on the reality of what they experienced. Whether the signal is best explained by atmospheric physics, by human activity, by a cross-cultural confluence of ritual and trade, or by something we do not yet name, the case compels us to widen our epistemic humility. Picture the basin at sunset, the salt flat cooling, the last light turning the ridges into razorbacks, and you standing there with a small recorder in your pocket, a notebook, and the patient desire to listen. The emotional pitch here is reverence, for the land, for those who have stewarded stories about it, and for the slow, collaborative work of turning phenomenon into knowledge. Keep your senses open, because whatever the final map of causality looks like, it will be richer for the range of voices and tools that help draw it. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.